Hello, I'm Mr. Moneyman. It's September 2008, and I'm here to talk about the national debt because we're hearing a lot about it during this election season. For example, just yesterday, one of the presidential candidates warned us that the national debt is, quote, a credit card we're taking out on our kids from the Bank of China. Well, that sounds pretty scary, and it sounds like our politicians think it would be great if we could pay off the debt and not burden our kids or grandkids with it. So I decided to check the facts and see what would happen if we paid down the debt. First, let's check who owns that debt so we know who will have to pay off to get rid of it. Here's a pie chart of how that $9.5 trillion breaks out. Our politicians make it sound like we owe most of it to China. Well, I checked the official numbers and here's who really owns what. Let's start with the biggest slice, $4.2 trillion. The U.S. government owes that piece of it to the U.S. government. In other words, it owes it to itself. That's the trust funds that we keep hearing about. How about the next biggest slice, $2.8 trillion? Well, the government owes that to U.S. citizens. Well, so far we've accounted for $7 trillion of the debt, still no China. Obviously, China's in the remainder of the debt the government owes to foreigners. We owe Japan that much, $0.6 trillion. We owe China $0.5 trillion. We owe the UK $0.3 trillion. OPEC $0.2 trillion, and all other foreigners we owe $1.1 trillion. Now, one last important note, a key distinction the government makes in its books between the debt it owes itself and the publicly held debt. The reason for that key distinction is this. For every debt there's an asset. Now here's an example of one of those assets. That's a savings bond. Should look familiar. The person who owns this owns a piece of the national debt. Now, in the case of the debt the government owes to itself, the government not only owes the debt, it also owns the treasury bonds. Now, the debt the government owes to the public is a little different. The government owes the debt, but somebody else owns the bonds. We and some foreigners own all those bonds. Many of us have the savings bonds to prove it in our safe deposit boxes and our cookie jars. And by the way, I think our kids and grandkids would be happy to inherit these from us. Well, now we know who the government owes its debt to. Let's set this aside now and think about what would happen if we paid off the debt. Here are the three key players, the government, the taxpayers, and the foreigners. And here's the publicly held debt we just talked about. It's a mid-2008 snapshot, and the government owes, as we talked about before, close to $3 trillion. Obviously, I rounded both of these up a little bit from the numbers we looked at before. And we owe foreigners close to $3 trillion. Now let's assume everybody has these bonds in their safe deposit boxes. And now let's just say that our politicians, government officials, news media, and others have scared us so badly about leaving all that debt to our kids and grandkids that we also stashed away enough cash in our safe deposit boxes to pay it all off. Just hypothetically. Let's say we put away $6 trillion. There's the cash we'll assume we stashed away in those same safe deposit boxes. And now let's add it all up. You can tell that the financial assets everybody has stashed away, hypothetically, $6 trillion in cash and $3 trillion in bonds on the U.S. taxpayer side, and the foreigners have $3 trillion in bonds, treasury bonds, in their safe deposit boxes. But remember, this whole exercise is about paying off the debt. We want to see what happens when we do that. So let's say we elect the politicians who made us think that's a good idea. They take office and then they proceed to get rid of all those IOUs, $6 trillion worth of them. First, they tax that $6 trillion cash away from us. That's what it's going to take to pay back all that debt. Now they're ready to do that. They're ready to get rid of all that debt once and for all. So they buy back all the IOUs, first from foreigners, let's say, and then from us. And then the government, now that it's bought back all these IOUs, but just puts them in the shredder, gets rid of them. At last, no more debt, it's all paid off. But wait, will our kids and grandkids really like what we just did? To answer that, we need to recalculate the financial assets they would inherit. So let's add up what's left in everybody's safe deposit boxes. $3 trillion on our side, $3 trillion on the foreigner's side. Oops, this isn't a pleasant surprise. If we paid off the debt, it looks to me like our kids and grandkids would inherit a lot less from those safe deposit boxes, and the foreigners would still end up with their same $3 trillion in assets. Here's a comparison of what our kids and grandkids would get. If we don't pay down the debt, as we calculated before, they'd get $9 trillion out of our safe deposit boxes. If we do pay down the debt, they inherit $3 trillion out of our safe deposit boxes. Well, now do you think paying down the debt is a good idea? You decide, then tell our politicians, officials, and news reporters. Well, thanks for listening. This is Mr. Moneyman with some food for thought about our not so bad national debt.